The autumn of 1907 did not arrive in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a gentle display of vibrant foliage. It descended upon the jagged peaks like a slow, suffocating exhalation. In the deeply isolated, lawless logging territories of Appalachia, the changing of the season brought only the biting, metallic threat of the first mountain frost and the heavy, inescapable scent of dying pine needles and raw, violently harvested sap. At the dark heart of this unforgiving wilderness sat Blackwood Station, a brutal, soot-choked timber camp dominated entirely by backbreaking labor, unregulated industry, and a deeply ingrained, suffocating culture of silence. It was a place where desperate men swung heavy iron axes for pennies a day, and where questions asked by outsiders were frequently permanently buried beneath the dense, rotting undergrowth of the forest floor. It was into this hostile, fiercely guarded ecosystem that Arthur Pendleton rode on a freezing, bruised Tuesday afternoon. Arthur was a young, highly educated and entirely inexperienced auditor dispatched directly from the Federal Census Bureau in Washington, D.C. He was a man of pristine ledgers, crisp linen suits, and orderly, civilized logic, woefully out of his depth in a landscape that actively rejected federal authority. But Arthur had not been sent to Blackwood Station to count the living. He had been sent to find any remaining trace of the missing. Exactly 1 year prior, in the bitter early winter of 1906, his predecessor, a seasoned, hardened census taker named Elias Thorne, had ridden up into these exact same mountains to audit the logging barons' heavily guarded labor camps. Elias had signed the registry at the Valley boarding house, mounted his horse, and ridden up the steep, winding ridge trail. He was never seen or heard from again. The local, deeply corrupt county sheriff had quickly officially dismissed the disappearance, citing the treacherous terrain and a sudden, blinding winter squall, concluding that Elias had simply lost his footing and perished in the frozen wilderness. But the Bureau was not satisfied with the lazy, convenient narrative of a tragic accident. Arthur was determined to retrace the missing man's final documented steps. A grim, exhaustive investigation that inevitably led him up the most treacherous, overgrown, and geographically isolated switchbacks in the entire county, toward a property that sat completely alone at the absolute precipice of the ridge, the Vance Farmhouse. Before we step out of the freezing Appalachian rain and cross the threshold of this deeply unsettling home, I'd like to take a brief moment to welcome you. If you are fascinated by the dark, hidden corners of history and the chilling, forgotten mysteries that refuse to stay buried, I would be absolutely honored if you would subscribe to the channel. We slowly unravel these historical nightmares together, and having you join us around the fire makes this entire journey possible. Now let's pull our coats tight against the biting wind and follow the young auditor up the mountain. As Arthur's exhausted, heavily lathered horse finally breached the dense, shadow-drenched tree line, the sky above the ridge violently bruised a deep, sickening purple. The looming threat of a severe autumn storm instantly materialized into a freezing, torrential downpour, the heavy, icy rain lashing aggressively against Arthur's face and instantly soaking through his heavy wool coat. Seeking immediate, desperate shelter, he spurred his horse across the muddy, desolate yard toward the sagging front porch of the farmhouse. The structure was a bleak, weather-beaten monument to pioneer isolation, its rough-hewn timber walls completely devoid of paint, its windows narrow and heavily shadowed. Arthur pounded heavily on the thick oak door, his knuckles raw from the cold. For a long, agonizing minute, there was only the deafening roar of the freezing rain hammering the slate roof. Then, the heavy iron deadbolts violently slid back, and the door creaked open to reveal the two women who ruled this desolate peak. Abigail Vance, the elder sister at 50, stood entirely rigid in the doorway. She was a stern, fiercely pragmatic woman with a face carved from the very mountain granite she lived upon. She stared at the shivering federal agent with a cold, unblinking assessment, her right ear angled slightly toward him to compensate for the absolute, profound deafness in her left. Standing nervously just behind her shoulder was Martha, the younger sister. The contrast was jarring. Martha was physically frail, her eyes wide and heavily shadowed. completely consumed by a severe, deeply ingrained nervous exhaustion. She flinched violently at the sudden, sharp cracks of thunder echoing down the valley, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she clutched a frayed woolen shawl to her chest. With a stiff, reluctant nod, Abigail stepped aside, silently offering the freezing auditor sanctuary from the violent storm. Arthur murmured his profound gratitude, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes, and stepped over the heavy wooden threshold into the dimly lit interior of the farmhouse kitchen. But as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the howling wind, a sudden, profound, and deeply unsettling physical sensation washed over him. The immediate atmosphere of the house was entirely, fundamentally wrong. Arthur had stepped into hundreds of rustic mountain cabins during his brief tenure, expecting the familiar, comforting sounds of his leather boots striking hollow, echoing wooden floorboards. Instead, his footsteps landed with a dull, heavy, and completely acoustically dead thud. Arthur slowly lowered his gaze from the sisters to his feet, and the breath instantly froze in his lungs. The entire ground floor of the farmhouse was an architectural impossibility, a massive, obsessive anomaly that practically screamed of severe, localized paranoia. There was not a single square inch of exposed wooden flooring in the entire room. The original pine boards had been meticulously, entirely sealed, covering the entire floor. Running perfectly flush against the baseboards and stretching into the shadowed corners of the parlor was a thick, hardened, and incredibly uneven layer of black, industrial roofing pitch. The caustic, heavy, chemical smell of the tar still lingered faintly in the stagnant air of the cabin, but the pitch was merely the adhesive foundation for the true, terrifying barrier. Completely overlaying the blackened tar were massive, incredibly heavy, overlapping sheets of solid, dull gray industrial lead. The installation was manic, frantic, and aggressively permanent. Thousands upon thousands of heavy, forged iron tacks had been driven violently through the dense lid sheeting and the hardened pitch, securing the heavy metal directly into the hidden wood below. The tacks were not placed with the measured precision of a carpenter. They were hammered in chaotic, clustered, overlapping rows, as if the sisters had been completely terrified that the edges of the metal might somehow peel upward. It was not a floor designed for warmth, aesthetic appeal, or structural integrity. It was an impenetrable, incredibly expensive, metallic skin. It was a massive, obsessive effort to completely, entirely soundproof the earth beneath their feet, creating an ironclad acoustic vault designed specifically to ensure that the women living in the house could never, ever hear whatever might be buried in the dark, limestone crawlspace directly below them. Arthur stood entirely paralyzed, just inside the doorway, the freezing mountain rain dripping heavily from the brim of his felt hat and pooling darkly on the dull, oxidized surface of the lead. The profound acoustic deadness of the room was completely disorienting, practically sucking the ambient noise of the raging storm outside straight into the heavy metal. When Abigail Vance moved across the kitchen to stir a blackened cast iron pot hanging over the hearth, her heavy leather boots did not produce the familiar hollow clatter of wood. They merely yielded a flat, muffled, and deeply unnatural thud, as if she were walking across a solid vault door. Arthur forced himself to blink, violently shaking off the creeping, primal dread that had seized his chest and formally introduced himself. He reached into his damp coat, retrieving his official leather-bound Federal Census Bureau credentials, and presented them to the elder sister. Abigail did not take the leather booklet. She simply stared at the gold-embossed federal eagle for a long, calculating moment, her jaw set in a line of cold, uncompromising iron. Arthur, his voice trembling slightly against the oppressive silence of the lead-lined room, stated his official business. He explained that the Bureau was conducting a rigorous, exhaustive trace of Elias Thorne, explicitly detailing the missing man's route up this very ridge in the late autumn of 1906. At the mention of Elias Thorne's name, Abigail did not flinch, nor did her cold, pragmatic expression alter by a single fraction of an inch. She angled her head slightly, offering her functional right ear, and spoke in a flat, gravelly tone, entirely devoid of hesitation or warmth. She claimed, with terrifying rehearsed perfection, that the man had indeed ridden up to their property during the first bitter freeze of the previous year. He had tied his horse to the front post, sat at their table, drank a single cup of bitter chicory coffee, and asked his federal questions. According to Abigail, Elias had complained extensively about the rapidly dropping barometric pressure and had ridden back down the mountain trail well before the first blinding squall of the winter had hit the ridge. It was a perfectly constructed, completely impenetrable alibi that laid the entirety of the blame squarely on the treacherous Appalachian weather. But Arthur's sharp, analytical eyes were not fixed on the stoic, unyielding face of the elder sister. He was watching Martha. The frail younger woman was standing near the heavy porcelain washing basin, her back pressed tightly against the rough timber wall. At the exact moment Arthur spoke Elias's name, a violent, full-body tremor had ripped through Martha's fragile frame. Her pale, heavily veined hands clutched her frayed woolen shawl with a white-knuckled, terrifying intensity. But the detail that made the blood run absolutely cold in the young auditor's veins was her line of sight. Martha was not looking at Arthur, nor was she looking at her sister. Her wide, deeply shadowed eyes were aimed directly, obsessively downward. She was staring at the heavy, overlapping seams of the industrial lead sheeting directly beneath the heavy oak dining table. Her gaze tracked the chaotic, tightly clustered rows of forged iron tacks with a frantic, paralyzing terror, her jaw trembling as if she were desperately, silently fighting the urge to press her hands over her ears, the violent autumn storm raging. Outside, the farmhouse aggressively intensified as the afternoon bled into a bruised, suffocating twilight. The freezing rain turned into a heavy, driving sleet that battered the thick window panes like a barrage of shattered glass. Abigail coldly, pragmatically informed Arthur that the steep, jagged switchbacks leading back down to Blackwood Station would be completely washed out and entirely impassable until the morning sun managed to freeze the mud solid. She offered him a sparse, rigid wooden chair at the heavy oak table and a tin cup of boiling chicory water, silently communicating that her hospitality extended no further than the absolute, bare minimum required for a federal agent. Arthur sat at the table, the heavy wooden legs resting bluntly against the cold grey lead. He was an auditor, a man whose entire professional existence was built upon the meticulous, undeniable truth hidden within numbers, ledgers, and localized commerce. His highly trained eyes naturally began to systematically scan the dim, aggressively sealed kitchen. Near the heavy wood-burning stove, impaled brutally upon a long rusted iron nail driven into the timber wall, was a thick spindle of curled, yellowing mercantile receipts. They were the tedious, mundane records of mountain survival: bulk flour, salted pork, kerosene, and lye soap. When Abigail briefly turned her back to throw a heavy, split pine log onto the fire, Arthur smoothly leaned forward, his fingers silently brushing through the stack of oxidized paper. He stopped on a massive, heavily stamped receipt from the primary industrial mercantile located in the valley of Blackwood Station. The items itemized on the ledger completely stripped the remaining breath from his lungs. The sisters had purchased 400 pounds of raw industrial roofing pitch, 24 tightly rolled sheets of heavy-gauge roofing lead, and 10 heavy boxes of forged iron masonry tacks. The cost was staggering, an absolutely exorbitant sum that would have entirely completely drained the meager life savings of 2 isolated pioneer women. But it was the date, stamped clearly in heavy black ink at the bottom of the receipt, that confirmed Arthur's darkest, most terrifying suspicions. The massive purchase had been finalized and hauled up the mountain on November 18, 1906. It was the exact specific week that Elias Thorne had vanished from the earth. They had not sealed the floor to protect against the damp winter chill. They had purchased the heavy metal and the caustic pitch mere days after the federal agent had supposedly ridden away. The chronological proximity was not a coincidence. It was the undeniable paper trail of a massive, frantic cover-up. As the pitch-black, suffocating night finally consumed the ridge, Abigail bluntly instructed Arthur to sleep in the small, unheated wooden loft situated directly above the main kitchen. The loft was accessed by a steep, rickety timber ladder, a narrow, deeply claustrophobic space tucked beneath the heavy slate roof. Arthur climbed into the dark, wrapping his heavy wool coat tightly around himself, and lay down on a thin, freezing straw mattress. The floorboards of the loft were standard, untreated Appalachian pine, completely devoid of the heavy pitch and lead that entombed the ground floor below. By 2 a.m, the violent driving sleet finally exhausted itself, leaving the isolated farmhouse suspended in a crushing, absolute and profoundly heavy mountain silence. The oppressive acoustic deadness of the lead-lined room below seemed to actively swallow even the sound of Arthur's own ragged breathing. He lay perfectly still in the freezing dark, his mind frantically racing through the horrific implications of the mercantile receipt and Martha's deeply paranoid, unbroken stare at the floor. Then, in the absolute pitch-black silence of the witching hour, Arthur felt it. It was not a sound that could be heard through the heavy, stagnant air of the cabin. The lead and pitch had successfully, entirely, completely eliminated the transfer of acoustic sound waves from the earth below. But the sisters, in their frantic, uneducated desperation, had fundamentally misunderstood the basic laws of physics. They had silenced the air, but they could not silence the structural wood. Arthur's right ear was pressed firmly against the cold, untreated pine floorboards of the loft. Traveling directly up the vertical, load-bearing timber studs hidden within the walls of the farmhouse, vibrating directly into the wooden joists supporting the loft, was a faint, heavily muffled, but distinctly rhythmic, physical vibration. Thump. Thump, thump. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate transfer of kinetic energy. It was the distinct, unmistakable vibration of something heavy and solid, desperately, rhythmically striking the underside of the original wooden floorboards, completely trapped beneath the layer of lead and pitch. It was not the random settling of an ancient stone foundation, nor was it the scratching of a wild animal seeking winter shelter in the crawlspace. The cadence was entirely, undeniably human. Someone, or something, was in the dark, forgotten limestone void directly beneath the farmhouse, and they were methodically, desperately trying to signal the world above. Arthur lay completely paralyzed upon the thin, freezing straw mattress, the heavy rhythmic thudding vibrating through the structural timber of the loft, like a grim, metronomic beat of pure, unadulterated desperation. For what felt like an agonizing eternity, the young auditor did not dare to move, his wide, terrified eyes staring blindly into the pitch-black space above him. Eventually, as the brutal Appalachian storm outside finally blew itself out into a frigid, exhausted drizzle, the muffled thumping slowly, painfully weakened. The cadence lost its rhythmic strength, devolving into faint, erratic and deeply pathetic scrapes against the hidden wood, before finally, inevitably ceasing entirely. When the bruised, washed-out grey light of dawn finally seeped through the cracks in the loft's heavy slate roof, Arthur slowly descended the rickety timber ladder. His face was a stiff, heavily controlled mask of calculated bureaucratic composure, actively, desperately concealing the absolute, paralyzing terror that gripped his chest. The kitchen was violently cold, the fire in the massive stone hearth having completely burned down to pale, smoking ash during the long night. Abigail and Martha Vance were already awake, their gaunt frames wrapped tightly in heavy, damp wool, shawls. Abigail tersely informed the federal agent that the creek at the bottom of the ridge had heavily swollen with the storm's runoff, and they were forced to haul the week's heavy washing down to the rocky banks before the afternoon freeze set in. It was a grueling, back-breaking chore that would remove them from the farmhouse for at least 2 hours. She instructed Arthur to remain inside, explicitly ordering him to split the remaining pine logs and heavily stoke the hearth, flatly forbidding him from wandering the perimeter of the heavily forested, rain-slicked property. The very moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind them and Arthur watched their grey, hunched figures completely disappear into the dense, fog-choked tree line through the frosted window pane, The young auditor moved with a sudden, frantic, and entirely terrified purpose. He knew he could not simply pry the massive, overlapping sheets of industrial lead-up with his bare hands or a standard pocket knife. The thousands of forged iron tacks and the deeply hardened thick layer of industrial roofing pitch created an incredibly resilient, practically impenetrable metallic armor over the earth. He needed to fundamentally compromise the adhesive foundation. Arthur moved quickly to the heavy stone hearth, using a pair of iron tongs to aggressively stoke the dying red embers. He grabbed the longest, heaviest forged iron fire poker resting against the stone mantel and violently thrust the thick, heavy wedge of the metal directly into the hottest, glowing core of the coals. He waited in the stifling, oppressive acoustic silence of the lead-lined kitchen, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, watching obsessively until the tip of the heavy iron poker began to radiate a fierce, blistering, and angry cherry red heat. Pulling a thick, heavily stained leather work glove over his right hand to protect against the searing heat rapidly traveling up the iron shaft, Arthur carefully pulled the glowing poker from the fire. He did not attempt to breach the floor in the center of the main kitchen. The sheer, undeniable visual evidence of the ruined lead would instantly condemn him the moment the sisters returned. Instead, he carried the blistering iron into the deep, heavily shadowed confines of the narrow pantry at the back of the house, a small cramped storage space smelling heavily of cured salt pork and dried mountain apples. He knelt onto the cold, dull grey lead, the heavy metal immediately sapping the ambient warmth from his knees, and identified a dark corner where two incredibly thick sheets of the industrial metal unevenly overlapped. Taking a sharp, trembling breath, Arthur violently pressed the glowing cherry-red tip of the iron fire poker directly against the heavy seam of the lead and the hardened pitch beneath. The chemical reaction was instantaneous, violent, and deeply noxious. The thick black roofing tar beneath the metal instantly boiled, emitting a loud, aggressive, and highly toxic hiss that echoed sharply in the small, cramped pantry. A thick, sickening plume of acrid black smoke violently erupted from the melting seam, instantly burning Arthur's eyes and searing the back of his throat with the heavy, paralyzing taste of burning chemicals and caustic sulfur. Ignoring the violent burning in his lungs, Arthur aggressively worked the searing iron back and forth, melting a wide circular trench through the impenetrable pitch, fundamentally destroying the adhesive seal holding the lead to the hidden wood. Dropping the rapidly cooling fire poker onto the metal floor, Arthur grabbed a flat-headed iron wedge used for splitting kindling. He drove it violently beneath the curled, bubbling edge of the heavy lead sheet, using his entire terrified body weight to violently pry the incredibly heavy metal upward. The forged iron tacks screamed in violent protest, ripping aggressively from the hidden wood with sharp, ear-splitting metallic shrieks. With an agonizing, back-breaking heave, Arthur bent the thick, heavy sheet of lead completely backward, finally exposing the original untreated Appalachian pine floorboards that the sisters had tried so desperately, so expensively to bury. The wood was heavily stained with the melted black pitch, but it was structurally weak, severely rotting from years of deep subterranean moisture permanently trapped beneath the impermeable metallic skin. Arthur did not hesitate. He raised the heavy iron wedge high above his head in the dark pantry and brought it down with devastating explosive force directly onto the rotting pine. The floorboard shattered instantly, a massive, jagged hole violently opening into the pitch-black, forgotten void of the limestone crawlspace below. The moment the wood violently gave way, the house aggressively exhaled. A putrid, freezing, and overwhelmingly concentrated blast of stagnant subterranean air violently rushed up through the jagged hole, hitting Arthur directly in the face like a physical blow. It did not smell like dry earth or forgotten cellar dust. It carried the heavy, deep, and sickeningly sweet coppery odor of profound, localized biological decay, mixed aggressively with the sharp, metallic scent of damp limestone and ancient, stagnant water. It was the distinct, unmistakable, and completely paralyzing smell of an open, rotting grave. Gagging violently into the sleeve of his heavy wool coat, Arthur scrambled backward into the kitchen, his eyes watering heavily from the toxic pitch smoke and the putrid draft. He grabbed a heavy brass kerosene lantern from the dining table, struck a sulfur match with trembling, bloodless fingers, and crept back into the shifting shadows of the pantry. He slowly, terrifyingly lowered the flickering amber light directly through the shattered floorboards, illuminating the forgotten pitch-black abyss directly beneath the farmhouse. The crawl space was far deeper than any standard pioneer foundation. It was a massive, naturally occurring limestone cavern, the sheer, jagged rock walls plummeting downward into an uncharted subterranean dark. But resting directly on a narrow, protruding ledge of wet rock just 10 feet beneath the shattered floor was an object that made Arthur's blood turn to absolute freezing ice. It was a heavily water-damaged, heavily mildewed, thick leather satchel. The heavy brass buckles were severely oxidized, turning a sickly, toxic green in the deep dampness, but the heavily embossed gold leaf lettering on the front flap was still perfectly, undeniably legible in the weak amber lantern light. It was the official, federally issued seal of the United States Census Bureau. It was Elias Thorne's bag. The missing federal auditor had never ridden back down the treacherous mountain trail in the winter of 1906. He had been violently thrown down into this deep, forgotten limestone sinkhole, a natural, inescapable subterranean oubliette hidden entirely beneath the Vance property. But the true, absolute, mind-shattering horror of the Appalachian farmhouse was not the discovery of the missing man's rotting possessions. As Arthur's trembling hand slightly shifted the angle of the brass lantern, the weak, flickering amber beam washed over the underside of the heavy, untreated pine floorboards, immediately surrounding the jagged hole he had just violently chopped open. The breath was completely, violently stripped from Arthur's lungs, a cold, primal wave of nausea washing over his entire body. The entire underside of the hidden wooden floor was completely, systematically, and heavily destroyed. The thick pine was deeply gouged, violently splintered, and heavily, darkly stained with vast, sweeping smears of dried, oxidized black blood. Covering every single inch of the exposed timber were thousands upon thousands of deep, frantic, and entirely desperate scratch marks. The horrific, agonizing realization violently fractured Arthur's logical, civilized mind. The rhythmic, muffled thudding he had heard in the dead of the night was not the sound of a newly trapped animal. Elias Thorne had not died from the initial fall into the dark. He had survived the drop into the absolute pitch-black abyss. And for days, perhaps agonizing, freezing weeks, the starving, terrified federal agent had stood on that wet limestone ledge, desperately, frantically clawing his bare hands into the underside of the farmhouse floor, screaming for mercy, completely unaware that the two women sitting directly above him had methodically, coldly purchased hundreds of pounds of pitch and heavy lead to permanently, utterly deafen themselves to his dying agony. Which country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. Utterly deafen themselves to his dying agony. The heavy brass lantern slipped from Arthur's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the dulled lead and rolling toward the jagged edge of the abyss, its weak amber beam spinning wildly into the dark. The young federal auditor scrambled violently backward on his hands and knees, his breath coming in sharp, terrified gasps, fully expecting the cold steel of an axe or the deafening roar of a shotgun to end his life in the suffocating shadows of the pantry. The heavy forged iron hinges of the front door shrieked in protest, violently shattering the tense silence of the farmhouse. Abigail and Martha Vance had returned from the swollen creek far earlier than anticipated, their heavy, wet wool shawls clinging to their gaunt, freezing frames. Arthur grabbed the rapidly cooling, heavy iron fire poker from the floor, scrambling to his feet and backing himself entirely into the corner of the pantry, the toxic, acrid smoke of the melted pitch still aggressively swirling around his face. He braced himself for a brutal, desperate fight for survival, entirely convinced he had just unearthed the horrific, localized killing floor of two deeply psychotic mountain widows. But the attack never came. Martha Vance stepped into the kitchen, the heavy wicker basket of wet laundry slipping from her frail, calloused hands to hit the lead floor with a dull, heavy thud. She looked past Arthur, her wide, deeply shadowed eyes locking instantly onto the jagged, smoking hole he had chopped through the impenetrable metal. She did not scream in rage, nor did she reach for a weapon. Instead, her frail legs completely gave out. Martha collapsed entirely to the cold, industrial floor, curling into a tight, trembling ball, and completely broke down into heavy, agonizing, and intensely hysterical weeping. It was not the terrified sobbing of a cornered murderer. It was the profound, soul-crushing, and overwhelmingly violent relief of a woman who had carried an unbearable, mind-shattering secret for an entire year, finally watching the iron dam break. Abigail Vance did not drop to the floor. The elder sister stepped slowly, heavily into the kitchen, the freezing mountain wind howling briefly before she reached out and deliberately, violently slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the massive iron deadbolt with a chilling finality. She looked at Arthur, gripping the iron poker like a terrified child, and then she looked down into the pitch-black abyss where the ruined, blood-stained underside of her original floorboards was now completely exposed. The rigid, uncompromising granite of her face finally, tragically cracked. Her eyes filled with a profound, suffocating shame and a deep, bottomless exhaustion. "Put the iron down, Mr. Pendleton," Abigail rasped, her voice thick and trembling, entirely stripped of its cold, pragmatic armor. "We are not the monsters you think we are, but God forgive us. We let the monsters win." Abigail slowly crossed the room, her boots moving with a heavy, leaden cadence, and sat down at the heavy oak dining table. She did not try to stop Arthur from staring into the hole. Instead, as Martha continued to weep hysterically on the floor, the elder sister began to systematically, agonizingly unspool the true, horrific reality of Blackwood Station. The paralyzing truth was that the sisters had never harmed a single soul. They were simply the isolated, deeply terrified collateral damage of an industrial empire built entirely upon blood and absolute corruption. The true architect of the nightmare was the logging baron, a ruthless, heavily armed, and completely untouchable industrialist who ruled the sprawling Appalachian timber camps with an iron fist. He paid off the local magistrates, owned the corrupt county sheriff, and violently crushed any whisper of dissent among his starving, desperate laborers. And he had a highly efficient, terrifyingly permanent method for dealing with problems that could not simply be bought. Abigail pointed a trembling, calloused finger toward the jagged limestone ridge rising sharply behind the farmhouse. High up in the dense, impenetrable pine forest, completely hidden by aggressive mountain briars and deadfalls, was a massive, naturally occurring limestone sinkhole. It was a deep, vertical geological fissure that connected directly to the sprawling, labyrinthine cavern system sitting squarely beneath the Vance property. The logging baron used this hidden, subterranean void as a secret, inescapable oubliette. When union organizers attempted to strike, when rival timber foremen refused to sell their claims, or when overly inquisitive federal auditors like Elias Thorne rode up the mountain asking dangerous questions, the baron's enforcers simply ambushed them in the dark. They dragged them into the woods, stripped them of their weapons, and violently threw them down the massive sinkhole. They did not kill them first. The drop was deep enough to permanently trap a man, but rarely fatal. The victims survived the violent fall, plunging into absolute freezing pitch blackness, left to wander the jagged subterranean labyrinth until they slowly, agonizingly succumbed to exposure, dehydration, or profound psychological madness. But the horror did not end in the deep earth. As Abigail spoke, her voice breaking, the true, mind-shattering psychological torture inflicted upon the sisters crystallized in Arthur's mind. Elias Thorne had not simply laid down and died in the dark. Driven by sheer, desperate survival instinct, the seasoned federal agent had blindly, agonizingly navigated the pitch-black, freezing cavern system for days. Eventually, looking upward in the absolute void, he had seen a faint, miraculous sliver of light. It was the warm, flickering amber glow of the sisters' hearth fire shining down through the tiny natural gaps in the original untreated pine floorboards of the farmhouse. Elias had dragged his broken, starving body up onto that wet, limestone ledge directly beneath the kitchen floor. And then, the true nightmare began. Abigail described the brutal, freezing winter of 1906. The heavy snows had completely trapped the sisters on the isolated ridge, and every single night, as the mountain winds howled, they were forced to sit at their dining table and listen to the horrific, agonizing consequences of the town's corruption. They listened to Elias Thorne weeping in the dark beneath their boots. They listened to him screaming until his vocal cords tore, desperately begging for a rope, a ladder, a morsel of bread, a drop of water. They listened to him violently, frantically clawing at the thick pine boards with his bare hands, his desperate fingernails tearing into the wood as he tried to dig his way up into the light. Arthur stood entirely frozen, the heavy iron poker slipping from his grip, his civilized mind completely failing to process the sheer, suffocating gravity of the situation. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking violently. "Why didn't you pull up the boards? Why didn't you save him?" Martha, still curled on the heavy lead floor, let out a sharp, agonizing wail, burying her face completely in her hands. "Because they were watching us!" Abigail suddenly screamed, her voice a raw, jagged edge of pure, unadulterated terror. "The Baron's men, they ride the perimeter of our property every single night, making sure their secrets stay buried. If we had breached that floor, if we had pulled that federal agent up into our kitchen, they would have seen the light. They would have kicked down our door, slaughtered us like pigs, and thrown all three of us back down the hole." The sisters were completely trapped in an inescapable psychological hell. They were too poor to abandon their ancestral land, entirely, cut off from any legitimate law enforcement, and deeply, viscerally terrified of the ruthless loggers. They were forced into the darkest, most agonizing form of unwilling complicity. They had to sit in their own home and actively listen to a man slowly, agonizingly starving to death just inches beneath their feet, knowing they had the physical ability to save him, but lacking the power to survive the violent consequences. Driven to the absolute brink of psychological ruin, unable to bear another night of the desperate scratching, the agonizing begs, and the heavy, crushing guilt of their own enforced cowardice, the sisters broke. They took every single dime their father had left them, hitched their mule, and rode down into the valley. They bought the heavy industrial pitch and the thick sheets of dull gray lead. They returned to the freezing cabin, and in a frantic, manic, weeping frenzy, they boiled the toxic tar and hammered the heavy metal down over every single inch of the floor. They did not do it to trap Elias Thorne. They did it to permanently, entirely deafen the acoustics of the house. They built a heavy, ironclad acoustic vault around themselves, choosing to completely obliterate their own senses, sealing the floor so they would never, ever have to hear the terrifying sound of a man dying in the dark again. The profound, soul-crushing weight of Abigail's confession descended upon the freezing, lead-lined kitchen like a physical collapse of the atmosphere. The heavy, toxic, and acrid smoke from the melted industrial pitch still aggressively swirled in the narrow, shadowed confines of the pantry, but the sheer, paralyzing horror of the localized truth completely overpowered the caustic burning in Arthur Pendleton's lungs. He stood entirely motionless, his highly educated, civilized, and deeply bureaucratic mind violently fracturing against the jagged, uncompromising reality of Appalachian survival. His entire life, his entire career with the Federal Census Bureau, had been built upon the unwavering, absolute belief in the prevailing power of federal law, the sanctity of justice, and the undeniable truth of ink on paper. But standing in this isolated, deadened room, looking down into the pitch-black, frozen abyss where a good man had been left to frantically claw his own fingers to the bone, Arthur realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that the United States government did not exist on this mountain. There was only the logging baron, the crushing weight of the earth, and the agonizing primal instinct to survive. Arthur took a trembling, hesitant step toward the heavy oak door, his hand instinctively reaching for the rusted iron deadbolt. "I have to ride down to the station," he stammered, his voice a frail, broken whisper that barely registered in the acoustically deadened room. "I have to telegraph the capital. I have to bring the federal marshals up this ridge." Abigail Vance did not move from her rigid posture at the heavy oak dining table. She simply turned her cold, deeply exhausted eyes toward the young auditor, her face a mask of uncompromising, grim finality. "If you touch that iron deadbolt, Mr. Pendleton, you will never see the bottom of this mountain," she rasped, her voice devoid of any malice, carrying only the heavy, indisputable weight of a recognized fact. "The Baron's enforcers are camped at the base of the switchbacks right now, waiting for the mud to freeze. They know exactly who you are. They know exactly what agency you represent. And they know exactly why you rode up to our property. If you attempt to ride past them, if you try to speak a single word of what you have seen beneath our floorboards, the corrupt county sheriff will simply arrest you for trespassing. And tonight, when the sun goes down, they will drag you into the pines, strip you of your fine linen suit, and throw you directly down the iron chute to join Mr. Thorne in the dark." The absolute, terrifying certainty in her voice violently arrested Arthur's movement. He looked at Martha, who was still curled in a tight, trembling ball on the cold, dull grey lead, her frail hands clamped aggressively over her ears as if she were desperately trying to block out a sound that only she could still hear. And then Abigail slowly stood up. She walked heavily across the kitchen to a small wooden utility drawer built into the heavy stone hearth. She pulled it open and withdrew a heavy, forged iron claw hammer and a fresh, unopened cardboard box of thick, rusted masonry tacks. She walked slowly back across the room and held the heavy iron tools out toward Arthur. She did not threaten him, nor did she command him. She simply offered him the ultimate, horrific choice of complicity. "We are two dead women living in a graveyard, Mr. Pendleton," Abigail whispered, her voice finally breaking, tears of profound, agonizing shame welling in her eyes. "We cannot save the men the Baron drops into the earth, and we cannot save ourselves. But you have a life back east. You have a family. If you want to see them again, you have to bury your conscience right here, in this room. You have to help us close the grave." The psychological climax that tore through the young federal agent was absolute, a completely devastating internal collapse of morality and duty. Arthur looked at the heavy iron hammer, and then he looked down into the pitch-black abyss in the pantry, the putrid, sickly sweet smell of deep biological decay washing over his face. He imagined the agonizing, endless fall into the dark. He imagined the freezing, wet limestone, the total, suffocating sensory deprivation of the cavern, and the sheer, mind-shattering terror of slowly starving to death in the pitch black while the people above him went about their daily chores. The primal, desperate, overriding human instinct to live completely, violently overpowered his civilized conscience. With a trembling, bloodless hand, Arthur Pendleton reached out and took the heavy iron hammer. What followed was a deeply disturbing, practically silent, and entirely manic sequence of enforced complicity. Arthur and the two deeply traumatized sisters worked together in the freezing, shadowed confines of the pantry, their breath pluming in the stagnant air. They did not speak a single word to one another. Arthur retrieved the heavy, cherry-red iron fire poker from the hearth, violently pressing it against the chunks of hardened black pitch, melting the toxic, acrid tar into a thick, boiling adhesive. Together, using their combined, desperate physical strength, they violently bent the incredibly heavy, thick sheet of dull gray industrial lead back into its original, overlapping position over the shattered pine floorboards. Arthur knelt on the pie, cold metal, his hands covered in the sticky, burning black tar, and began to aggressively, rhythmically swing the heavy iron hammer. He drove the thick forged iron masonry tacks violently through the heavy lead and deep into the hidden rotting wood below. Crack, crack, crack. The deafening metallic impacts echoed violently in the small pantry, each swing of the hammer a deliberate physical act of burying the truth. He hammered row after row of the heavy iron tacks, aggressively resecuring the impenetrable metallic skin, systematically and entirely restoring the massive, iron-clad acoustic vault. When the final tack was violently driven flush with the lead, Arthur dropped the heavy hammer, his hands blistered and bleeding, his soul permanently, irreparably stained. The following morning, the violent Appalachian storm finally broke, leaving the isolated, jagged ridge completely buried beneath 3 feet of blinding, pristine, and entirely silent white snow. Arthur Pendleton did not look at Abigail or Martha Vance as he saddled his heavily rested horse in the freezing yard. He mounted the animal, his heavy wool coat pulled tightly around his shoulders, and rode slowly, silently back down the treacherous, snow-choked switchbacks. When he finally reached the soot-stained, heavily guarded logging camp of Blackwood Station in the valley below, the Baron's armed enforcers watched him closely from the porches of the boarding houses. Arthur did not make eye contact. He simply kept his head down, boarded the very first commercial coal train heading east, and never, ever returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains. 2 weeks later, sitting at a pristine, polished mahogany desk in the heavily heated, brilliantly lit federal offices in Washington, D.C., Arthur Pendleton dipped his expensive fountain pen into a well of dark, iron gall ink. With a trembling hand, he officially filled out the final bureaucratic paperwork for the Elias Thorne investigation. He meticulously, legally documented that he had traced the missing auditor's steps directly into a massive, unexpected winter squall. He officially concluded, with the full, undeniable authority of the United States government, that Elias Thorne had simply lost his footing in the blinding whiteout and tragically perished of winter exposure in the unmapped Appalachian wilderness. He signed his name at the bottom of the fraudulent document, sealing the horrific secret of Blackwood Station in a filing cabinet forever. But the nightmare did not end with the stroke of a federal pen. Deep in the freezing, isolated hollows of the West Virginia mountains, the brutal, unregulated industrial empire of the logging baron continued completely unabated. The Vance farmhouse remained standing at the absolute precipice of the ridge, a bleak, weather-beaten monument to profound psychological terror. And if you were to stand in the freezing, lead-lined kitchen of that isolated home in the dead of the winter, you would witness a scene of unspeakable, lingering horror. You would see Abigail and Martha Vance, 2 gaunt, practically skeletal women, pacing endlessly back and forth across the thick, dull gray industrial metal. They walk with a heavy, deliberate, and aggressively loud cadence, their eyes locked obsessively forward, willfully, desperately ignoring the faint, muffled, and entirely rhythmic scratching that has just agonizingly started up again on the underside of their floorboards.